Now, we're really lucky today because we got Ryerson University, great university, has got the Canadian ambassador to Washington, who I've known for a long time, my friend David MacNaughton. First question on the subject of trade issues. Where's Alex?
So at the end of September, as all of us know, the U.S. Commerce Department slapped duties of almost 220% on the import of the Bombardier C-Series jets into the U.S. The dispute started with Delta Airlines purchasing about 125 of these jets. Boeing brought forth a complaint to the Commerce Department saying that Bombardier was receiving full subsidies from the Canadian government, which is considered an unfair practice by the World Trade Organization, and that Bombardier was dumping the product on the U.S. market at below market prices. You commented on the dispute at the end of September, saying that Canada and Boeing had some proposals back and forth, but then Boeing walked away, hence why the duties were enacted. So like Bombardier, Boeing actually also received subsidies from the U.S. federal government, receiving about $64 billion in federal loans and guarantees from 2000 to 2014. So how can Canada fight back against the big bully that is Boeing, who's trying to stifle competition in the U.S. market? And what are you doing as the ambassador to keep this issue alive?
Good question. Well, I think just in general terms, what we've seen as a result of the rhetoric, not just coming out of the president, but a lot of politicians in the United States, is it has emboldened quite a number of U.S. industries to take actions through the Commerce Department, or not to settle things that they perhaps should have settled. Softwood lumber being a good example, where we effectively had a negotiated agreement when the Commerce Secretary took it back to his industry. They said, no, we don't want to do that. And in fact, we had been negotiating with Secretary Ross an agreement that would talk about what constitutes a subsidy. So you could have, we said, look, if we can agree on what constitutes a subsidy, then we can have free trade between Canada and the United States. And he said he thought that was a good idea. We started negotiating it. He went back to his industry and said, I've got really good news. We're going to negotiate this free trade and nobody's going to subsidize it. And they said, are you out of your mind? This isn't what we want. We want protectionism. We want to protect our market. And so what you're seeing, and you see it with Boeing, I mean, we did try I tried personally on 2 separate occasions to get Boeing to come to the table on either a strategic partnership with Bombardier, and then secondarily to come to some agreement as to what constituted a subsidy. And then together we could fight potential new entrants into the market, whether it be Russia or China or whomever, together at the World Trade Organization. But they were feeling pretty confident that they could get Commerce to do whatever they wanted them to, and so they weren't ready to do a deal. Now, unbeknownst to them, we actually weren't putting all our eggs in one basket, and we had reached out to Airbus, and Bombardier's done a deal with Airbus, subject to regulatory approvals, but if that gets approved, the final assembly will take place in Alabama. And I think that... Alabama. In any case, I mean, I think what we see right now is, and just by the way, the Boeing 787, the wings for that aircraft are manufactured in Japan. A lot of the component parts are manufactured in China. The C-Series plane has 52% U.S. content in it, higher than actually the 787. So this isn't about fact. This is about out-and-out protectionism. And we have to be ready to, do everything we can to give Canadian industry a fair shake. And that's what we're doing. So there's no such thing as just going down one track. You've got to be looking at 2 or 3 other things at the same time.
Do you want to give us a 2-minute answer to what's going on with softwood lumber?
As I say, we thought we had a deal this summer, which would have agreed that Canada would have limited its shipments of softwood lumber into the United States to a defined percentage. It was around 30%. But the U.S. industry needs 50% plus one of the U.S. industry need to sign off on any agreement, or they can then, it isn't binding. So they wouldn't sign off, so we continue to negotiate. We got reasonably close, and when the Prime Minister was down 3 weeks ago, we raised it with the President in the Oval Office. We could not come to an agreement, and we talked to our industry. We met with the provinces and with our industry and agreed that we would take the fight to the NAFTA dispute resolution Chapter 19 panel, which we are doing. The good news at the present moment is that the price of lumber is so high that our companies are still making money because of the high prices, even with varying duties, but some of them are as high as 25%. But the price has gone up so much that they're making money. So, but when the market goes down a bit, we'll have some challenges. I think that the softwood lumber case illustrates, though, why we have to have a robust dispute resolution mechanism within the NAFTA agreement or any of the trade agreements, because otherwise, the Commerce Department and U.S. courts are not objective, and they don't let facts get in the way of some of their decisions.
Kyle.
Hey, I like drinking Canadian milk, but I also like saving money. The 270% import tariff for any milk coming into Canada keeps U.S. milk out while propping up domestic prices. The system depends on 3 pillars: a tariff wall to block imports, strict quotas that determine how much each farmer can produce, and fixed prices to paid producers. The World Trade Organization has ruled that the high prices paid to Canadian farmers are subsidies, making exports very difficult and making the consumer pay high retail prices for dairy. How do you balance the needs of the agricultural industry with that of the local consumer, especially now that the U.S. has got around the tariff by supplying non-taxable protein-rich dairy products to use to make cheese and yogurt?
Well, this one is it's a challenging one. I mean, I think when Ambassador Lighthizer went to Congress and said, here's what our objectives are for the NAFTA negotiation, and they talked about getting rid of Canadian supply management. The Americans don't want to get rid of Canadian supply management. What they want is more market access at our prices, because they'll make a lot of money if they can sell into Canada, because the U.S. dairy industry is heavily subsidized. And if we were ever to go down the path of not having supply management, we would never do that deal and allow U.S. dairy products to come into the country when they're subsidizing them. And so you've got a different approach in Canada than you do in the United States. In the United States, the government subsidizes heavily the dairy industry. In Canada, the consumer pays for it. And there are many arguments that people have made that we should be, we should do away with it because of what you said about consumer prices. I think the corollary to that, however, is that we determined many years ago that having food security was an important thing. Being able to produce enough food in your country that you wouldn't have dislocation, you wouldn't have to rely on imports for key staples in people's diets, led us to have this supply management system. On the Class 7, the diafiltered milk issue, where the Americans found a way to get into the Canadian market without paying any duties. The dairy industry tried to get the government of Canada to put on those high tariffs on the diafiltered milk also. We refused to do so, and the reason we did was because it would have caused a real flare-up in our relationship with the U.S. at a particularly sensitive time. This was under the Obama administration, and they were trying to negotiate TPP, and they needed the dairy industry on side. And so we incurred some wrath from the dairy industry by not doing anything. But what the dairy industry in Canada did was they found a way to produce diafiltered milk themselves. priced it at world prices and basically cut the Americans out of the market. So it remains a contentious issue. Under the TPP agreement, we committed to allow an additional 5% international access into our market for dairy, but the Americans decided not to, or they backed out of TPP. So they will want to negotiate some increased access to our market through the NAFTA negotiations. They've said that. But at the present moment, the NAFTA negotiations aren't going particularly well, so we're not inclined to give them any increased access at the present moment.
Did you ever, in building a career, ever think that you were going to be in the Oval Office with the President of the United States?
No, I didn't.
Tell us what it's like.
Well, it is. I presented my credentials to President Obama in March of 2016. The week before the Prime Minister came down, and I went back in for the bilateral meeting with President Obama. And I've been in the Oval Office twice under Trump. I think the most exciting time was when I presented my credentials, because I had my 4 daughters there. And that was really a thrill, to have your kids there when you're, at the White House. It was really quite something. So, and my office, I know my office looks out on the Capitol building. I mean, it's probably the most spectacular view in Washington. I do, when I go in the office in the morning, I still pinch myself. So it's, it's an honor and a privilege to represent your country in anything, but to have that and that responsibility, I take it very seriously. I don't think I've ever worked so hard in my life, and there are days where it gets a bit discouraging. It's not easy, but on the other hand, it's exciting. It's like I said to somebody, when you have loved public policy and I love politics, to be in Washington at this time is like, being a kid in a candy store, really. I mean, it can be frustrating, but it's also fascinating.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for sharing that experience in your life, very inspiring. One criticism about North American politics and economy is that while the United States have increased their influence and power across the world, Canada and Mexico seem too focused in bonding with their bigger brother. President Trump, on the other hand, wants to impose his vision of the world by retracting or withdrawing from multilateral agreements such as the Paris Climate Change Accord, the Trans-Pacific Partnership we talked about, the Free Trade Agreement, the UNESCO recently, also the agreements with Cuba, and now possibly NAFTA. In this environment, other world powers are taking the lead to outweigh the growing isolationism of the United States and capitalize the opportunities of a less American-centered trade. What is Canada doing to grow its influence and commerce with the rest of the world?
Well, that's a good question, and you're quite right. I mean, we've had since 1948 sort of a world order where the Americans have taken the lead both on trade and on security, and there were 2 global powers until the fall of the Soviet Union, and then only the United States. And now the United States is quite clearly and palpably withdrawing in a number of areas. What Canada is doing, I mean, I think we have to be realistic about what we can do. And there are a number of things that we're doing. Some of them are hemispheric. So we are working with Mexico, we're working with Colombia, we're working with Argentina.
That guy's from Colombia.
Well, the Colombia, the peace that has come in Colombia is fantastic, and I think the cooperation between Colombia and Canada is really good. But we're working together on trying to resolve the Venezuelan situation. And there are things that Canada and Mexico and Colombia and other Latin American countries can do together that are really difficult for the United States to do, because it's, there's a fair bit of anti-Americanism in Latin America that goes back many, many decades. And so And we're working together on drug interdiction and human smuggling too, which is a really big problem throughout the region. And looking at extending free trade agreements, not just in NAFTA, but we've done them with Colombia, with Chile, with others in the region. So I think those things are important from a hemisphere point of view. On a global stage, we just did sign the CETA agreement with Europe. We have a framework agreement on the TPP countries without the United States. The Prime Minister is going to go to China before the end of the year. I don't know to what degree we will look at, trying to end up with a trade agreement with China. That will take some time, even if we decided to launch it right now. We are playing a role. Canada is the lead in Latvia with the NATO troops. And we have participated in a number of things like in Afghanistan, in Syria. And I think we're going to continue to work selectively in areas where, peace support is required. But, the reality is that, we're 35 million people, and we have to pick our spots, and we can't be all over the place. But I think the cooperation in the hemisphere is really better than I've seen it ever before, and I think that's really good. It's really positive through the OAS and just even a number of countries cooperating together, particularly on security and trying to resolve hemispheric disputes. The Venezuelan situation is a horrible one, and I mean it's not just the poverty that has been inflicted on the Venezuelan people, but also now the kind of oil that they were, cheap oil that they were using with Haiti and with other countries. They've had to put the prices up, which is inflicting other problems on the region. So we're trying our best, but we are only 35 million people.
Nikita, where's Nikita?
You've showered praises on Katie Telford on several occasions. In his recent book, Mr. Trudeau also praised her as hardworking, tough, honest, and wicked smart. You said that Katie had to battle two things in maneuvering through the political and bureaucratic maze: her age and being regarded as a little girl. Ryerson has a diverse cohort with a mix of candidates from different age groups. What personality traits and strengths of Katie Telford, according to you, could be useful to the younger candidates at Ryerson to battle the little girl, little boy stereotype?
I first met Katie when she was working for Gerard Kennedy, the Minister of Education in Ontario, and she impressed me very much because she was not just smart, but also really good judgment, and she was a good listener. And then when she left the government, I hired her into our consulting firm, and I remember the first thing she said to me is, she said, "I have no idea whether I can sell or not. I just don't know whether I'm going to be any good at that. I don't know, I've never done it before." And so I said, well, the only way to learn how to do it is just to go and do it. And she became one of our top-notch consultants, and she, the clients were impressed. When we went through the federal election campaign, it ended up being a very successful campaign, but I can tell you that throughout the piece, there were people criticizing. We were in third place when we started, even up until a month before the election, was held. There were people sniping at her, suggesting she should be replaced, that she didn't know what she was doing, that they needed somebody who was more experienced. And the reality is that we had a plan and we executed on it, and it worked. But she was tough and smart, but also just calm. She was very, very calm and didn't lose her temper or anything like that. And one of the things that's happened, and part of what we did during that campaign was also to reach out to other women. That's half the cabinet is women. But one of the things that I found, because I was co-chair of the Ontario campaign, was if you phoned a man and asked him to run, the answer was most often, how come it took you so long to call me? It was, well, of course you're going to ask me to run. With women, it was, really, do you think I'd be any good at it? And all of the superstructure in politics is set up, for men. One of the things that Katie's been able to do is really to change how things operate. Like we've looked at things like, sittings of the House of Commons. How do we make it more, family friendly? It's not just women that look after children, but we have a cabinet minister right now who is pregnant. She's going to have a baby in April, I think. And so we're having to look at all of the things, the systemic issues that have made it more difficult for women to play a full, meaningful role in every walk of life. And you talk about it in terms of the boards of directors. I mean, the reality is, we were looking at this in terms of some of the NAFTA thing. People have asked us, why do we put why do we want gender chapter in NAFTA? Well, 40% of the new businesses, the small businesses that are being formed today are being formed by women. But women-owned enterprises represent only 15% of the companies that are involved in exports. So there's obviously, some problems here, some systemic problems that we have to get at. And I just think, what Katie represents, and I think it's great, is a role model that you can, if you work hard, if you are smart, you've got judgment, you develop relationships, and people know that you are reasonable and fair, things are opening up for women. But we haven't done enough yet. There's way more to do. And I think she was the brains behind the women entrepreneurs meeting that took place in the Oval Office with President Trump. And I can tell you, of all of the meetings that I attended, which was all of the meetings, that was the most substantive one. The women that came to that table had really good ideas. And Katie's followed up with it, and we're now doing much more about it. So she's an exceptional person, and I think her goal is not just to be successful in politics, but to help to be sort of do some groundbreaking in terms of helping other women participate and have the same opportunity she's had.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for coming. There have been discussions to include gender equality as a way of protecting women's rights in renegotiated North American Free Trade Agreement. Although conservatives in Canada oppose the inclusion of gender equality and suggest NAFTA talks should focus primarily on jobs and economic issues, according to you, will including gender equality as a chapter to NAFTA agreement be beneficial for women? And what are the chances that US and Mexico will be persuaded to include it?
Well, and I may have the exact numbers wrong, but I'm not far off. In 1994, when NAFTA was signed, there were only 2 international trade agreements that had any kind of gender chapter in it. There are now 60. So this is not, in fact, I think the free trade agreement we signed with Chile most recently has a gender chapter in it too. So this is not something that is, the Americans have said, NAFTA is an economic agreement, that's a social policy. The reality is it's economic too. And I talked about the women, the number of women who start businesses and yet what happens in terms of exports. We feel fairly strongly that trade agreements should include it. And I think that the Mexicans have come around to the view that they are prepared to go along with it. So far, the U.S. has been resistant, but I still think at the end of the day we'll have it in there, and I think it's important to have it in there. I think it is anything that we do. We need to look at it through, the lens of what our values are. And one of the values that we have is promoting more gender equality. One of the values we have is, doing something about the tragedy of our Indigenous people. We have to do something about labor and environmental standards. And these are not things that are just to be sloughed off or to be looked at as social policy. They're an integral part of trade agreements. And I think one of the things that people have started to come to realize, what used to happen is that all these professional trade negotiators would get into a room, they'd negotiate for 2 years, and all these experts, and then they'd come out and they'd say, we've got an agreement, and it's going to be good for you, and you should understand that. And what we've seen happen, not just in the United States, but around the world, is that people are just saying, no, actually, we don't buy that. We actually don't think that there is enough inclusiveness in these trade agreements, and it's making some people very wealthy and leaving a whole bunch of other people behind. And so I think it's really important that we make sure that these trade agreements are more than the historic trade agreements, because we will not get people to buy into continuing to have rules-based freer trade if we don't do something more about inclusion. And I think if you look at the disruption that is going on in the economy right now through, all of the technological change that is going on, if we don't do a better job of making everyone feel as if they're part of these trade agreements, we won't be able to get them done. This is a negotiation, and unfortunately, at the present moment, it is not a negotiation like any other that we've had before. What the United States has done is basically said, here are our demands, and you need to accept them or else. The bureaucracy categorizes the proposals on rules of origin in the auto sector and the government procurement as unconventional. I'm not burdened with having to be nice about these things. I say it's ridiculous. They are clearly designed, or at least the outcome of those is actually to make it virtually impossible to find common ground. And so, I think it's hard to negotiate with someone when first of all, the proposals they're putting on the table will not achieve what they say they want to achieve, and secondly, where many of them would roll back our access to the market rather than increase it. So I think when we get around to, if they get around to beginning to put some reasonable things on the table, then we can have a talk about give and take. But right now, the major economic proposals that they've put forward don't make any sense.
Don't make sense. Okay. There's a question from Nino.
During the latest round of NAFTA negotiations, Canada and Mexico rejected the U.S. proposals, which include requirement for cars to have 50% American component. Second, sunset clause where NAFTA can be renewed in 5 years only if all parties agree to do so. And number 3, revamp and supply management over dairy products, just to name a few. And former Prime Minister Stephen Harper weighed in on NAFTA renegotiations, suggesting that the U.S. is prepared to take the risks of not having NAFTA and will continue to renegotiate for a better deal. According to the numbers provided by the U.S. Trade Representative, U.S. goods and services imports from Canada amounted to about $308 billion in 2016. This is roughly 20% of U.S. $1.5 trillion Canada's GDP in 2016. The fifth round of NAFTA renegotiation is scheduled November 17th to 21st in Mexico City. And considering your interview back in July 2017, you mentioned that there are plans and contingencies in place, taking into account various scenarios. Is Canada prepared for no NAFTA scenario, and how far is Canada willing to give in to U.S. requests in order to preserve NAFTA?
But this is on the public record. They're taping you here, and
Yeah.
so be careful.
Well, you know, I mean, on some of the specific issues, you know, the United States said that they wanted to move to 85% rules of origin on autos and 50% domestic content. That would devastate our industry, and we can't go along with that. I have reminded Secretary Ross and Ambassador Lighthizer that, you know, the President of the United States himself and Lighthizer have focused in on deficits mostly associated with manufacturing. And the United States has a $34 billion surplus with Canada in manufactured goods, $34 billion. So I did ask Secretary Ross what he was proposing to do to narrow that surplus the United States has with us in manufactured goods. He hasn't given me an answer yet, and I don't really expect one anytime soon. But I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do, and I think we've been reasonably successful at it, although not as, we have more work to do, is really to demonstrate to Americans, American politicians, American business leaders, that the end of NAFTA would hurt us, but it would hurt them too. And in some particular industries in some states, it would be devastating. And I think you've seen, you know, Secretary Perdue, Agriculture Secretary, talk about, you know, the potential really negative impacts for the U.S. agricultural sector. I have spoken with Governor Snyder of Michigan and Governor Sandoval of Nevada and Bevin and, you know, Ricketts, all the governors, most of them. And they're very much worried that any time, if NAFTA disappeared, that they'd have a real problem, that their economy would be hit very badly. So I'm hoping that that realization will cause the Americans sooner rather than later to try to find some common ground with us. I think the Minister Freeland said, you know, this is a negotiation and not a capitulation, and we want to have a renewed NAFTA. My comment about the 5-year sunset clause was, you know, that I felt that U.S. business would really oppose that because you can't make long-term investments when you don't know whether an agreement's going to last for more than 5 years. And in fact, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said exactly that to the trade representative. So I think, you know, once we get through tax reform, if they get through tax reform in the next couple of weeks, I think the attention will turn to NAFTA. And I think that whether it's next month or 2 months from now or whatever, I think we're going to end up in a positive renegotiation of NAFTA because I think it's in everybody's interest to have it. And I don't think that the President of the United States or or the Senate or the Congress in total will want to have the potential job losses that would occur if NAFTA went away, and I can tell you that will be the case. It'll hurt states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and those are the ones that politically, you know, the President of the United States is pretty sensitive to. So, you know. Can I guarantee you that we're going to end up with an agreement? No. The only thing I can guarantee you is that before we end up with an agreement, there's going to be lots of drama. There'll be lots of drama because that's the style. And we just have to remain focused on what we can control, what we can do, and not get distracted by a lot of the rhetoric. So that's what we're trying to do.
And do you think tax reform is going to go through? Are you following the votes?
You know, it's hard. The Senate bill has got, you know, some things that, you know, take away some benefits in Obamacare. That's going to be challenging for some people. The you know, expanding the deficit by, you know, or the debt by $1.5 trillion is going to cause some of the Republicans to have some indigestion. I mean, I don't know. You know, budget making and tax reform in the U.S. Congress is kind of like sausage making. I mean, you know, the result may taste all right, but you don't want to really look at it when it's going on. So it's a bit complicated, but I think there's an enormous amount of pressure on them to get some kind of tax reform done. I just don't think it's going to be as comprehensive as either the House bill or the Senate bill.
But the market is banking on tax reform. So if tax reform does not go through, those of us that have stocks, it's going to take, well, there's a short-term hit.
You have an extensive experience working in business and politics, including both government and political relations. You're currently Canada's ambassador to the United States and have been involved in, as well as spoken about the NAFTA discussions. The negotiations have been well reported on and appear to be quite intense, struggling with a way to ensure everyone is satisfied. You have said that you believe an agreement can be established that is a win-win for both Canada and President Trump. My question is, considering all of your experience working with various people in a variety of situations, do you have any tips or points you believe are crucial to good negotiations?
There is a difference between negotiating in the private sector and negotiating in the public sector. And the big difference is, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, was, you know, in business, you can yell and scream and fight and at 11 o'clock at night and sign a deal the next day at noon and shake hands and everybody's happy and they get a deal done. And that's because in business, people on both sides are really looking to do what is in their best economic interest. And it's pretty focused. They may make a mistake. They may not do what is in their best, but that's the way they're approaching it. They're saying, how do I get a deal that is of value to me, and the same thing on the other. In politics, it's different because you can come to the realization that the deal you're going to do is not a good deal, or is a good deal, but it's not politically palatable. So for instance, there's a Mexican presidential election in June of this coming year. As we get closer and closer and closer to that election, it's going to be more and more difficult for the Mexicans to appear to have given up anything to the President of the United States. And if you were in business, you wouldn't care about that, but you care about it when you're in politics. And so it adds a complexity to negotiations, particularly when all of this is taking place very much in the public domain. And I think to some degree, you know, some of the people in the current American administration don't fully appreciate, because they haven't been in politics all their lives, they don't appreciate that nuance, is that you can kind of put somebody back them into a corner where even a deal they should take, they can't take because of politics. Just in terms of general negotiations, you know, I remember somebody saying to me when I first started in business, and we were always sitting around, and the question always came up, you know, what's your bottom line? And this gentleman I knew who was much more experienced than I at the time said, don't spend any time worrying about what your bottom line is. Think about what the other guy's bottom line is. Because if you worry about what your bottom line is, I can guarantee you'll end up there. But if you try and figure out what their bottom line is, you got a chance of getting something that's better for you. And I think it's really interesting because every time I've sat around when we've been looking at buying a company or doing some kind of a deal, the discussion is, all right, well, what's our bottom line? And not so much thinking about put yourself in the other person's shoes, because if you don't put yourself in their shoes, you'll end up with a lousy deal.
It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a really honor. I love hearing you speak. It's really interesting to hear sort of your opinion on something that's really important. For me, my question is, the Supreme Court of Canada has stated that the Privacy Act has a quasi-constitutional status, and in the first annual report from the Privacy Commissioner stated that privacy is not simply a precious and often irreplaceable human resource. Respect for privacy is the acknowledgement of the respect for human dignity and the individuality of man. Several branches of the federal government of the United States, including the CIA and the NSA, clandestinely collect passively and actively data on Canadian citizens and residents whose data is housed by American companies, clearly violating the rights of these individuals. You, as the Ambassador of the United States, has the ability to raise this violation and seek a solution. Why aren't the privacy rights of Canadians a priority for your administration?
Bernie Sanders, right there.
Yeah, I mean, particularly these days, the issue of privacy is extraordinarily important, but it's also very, very complex. And, the Privacy Act is an important part of federal legislation, and as is the Charter of Rights, which protects citizens. On the other hand, the gathering of information, we have a duty, as well as protecting the privacy of people, we have to protect their safety. And, I can't go into details about individual cases other than ones that have been made public, but I do know, for instance, that the individual who was caught in Strathroy, Ontario, a couple of years ago, that was as a result of intelligence gathering on both sides of the border, where there was a recognition by the FBI that somebody was going to do something at a train station with a bomb, shared the information with the RCMP. As a result of some technological advances, they were able to identify who he was and where he was. And between the time that the initial information came to the FBI and they managed to get him, it was 3 hours. And he had the bomb in a taxi, and he was on his way to a train station. It's really hard, and that's why I think it's really important to have robust oversight, civilian oversight on these things, to try to balance off the needs of public security and privacy. It's not going to get any easier because of the technological advances that are going on, and that the ability to actually tap into what people are saying and doing, and all these things. I don't think there's any easy answer, but you cannot allow fear to take over your lives and end up with systemic privacy interventions. On the other hand, if we don't do things to protect our citizens, we will end up with fear, and we'll end up in a situation where excesses do occur. So, it's one of those things that, I'm glad I'm not having to make those judgments every day, because they're really tough. They really are. I know all of you are, sometimes thinking about, what are you going to do after this? What kind of job are you going to have? What kind of career are you going to pursue? And I would simply ask you to take a look at doing a stint in public service. in whatever way you choose, because it is tremendously rewarding, and we're going to need smart, dedicated people to do that, whether it be in politics, whether it be in government, whether it be in, some form of public service. Because, what I mentioned earlier about the disruptive technologies that are taking place, that are changing the world, they are going to demand people formulating public policy to really think outside of the box, because we're going to face some huge challenges. I mean, right now, it's just things like the regulation of Uber and Airbnb, but we're going to end up with some really big challenges, and the whole education system is going to have to go through a transformation in order to make sure that lifelong learning is part of our culture. I was in Banff 2 months ago, and there was a fellow from California who was talking, and he said in 1940, in all but 2 of the states of the United States, farmer was the top job category. So all but 2 states in 1940. And he said today, in 38 states in the United States, truck driver is the top job category. Think 10 years from now, what's it going to be like? And many of those people who are truck drivers at the present moment are independent businessmen. This isn't, some great big huge company that employs 100,000 truck drivers. And all of the things that are happening are going to, if our public policy doesn't both catch up and stay ahead of some of these developments, we're going to have increasing pressures on the basic institutions that support our democracy. And I think the issue that you raised about privacy is but one of them. And we see today, the lack of confidence in politicians, in government, judicial system, in the media, all of the underpinnings that have formed an important part of our democracy. And I think these are going to continue to be challenged, and we need to have dedicated, smart people decide that they want to do that as part of their careers.
Ambassador, on behalf of Ryerson, I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
I agree 100%, and I want you to remember one thing. Hire Ryerson MBA students. Tell the world I'm their reference. Thank you very much.